The city lights of Manhattan sparkled like 1,000 diamonds, casting a gleaming reflection across the expansive windows of Sebastian Hayes' penthouse. A lavish party was in full swing, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the hum of lively conversation. The elite, clad in their finest designer attire, mingled and laughed, celebrating their wealth and status in a way that only the privileged could. But amidst the revelry, Sebastian stood apart, as usual, towering in the corner of the room, surveying his domain with a detached, calculating gaze. At 35, he had everything: money, power, influence, and a reputation for ruthlessness. His empire spanned the globe, with his name whispered in the halls of the world's most prestigious boardrooms. To the world, Sebastian Hayes was the epitome of success, a man who had clawed his way to the top with a relentless drive and an iron will. He had learned early that emotions were a weakness, and relationships were mere transactions. People, to him, were tools. They existed to serve his interests, nothing more. He didn't have time for love, for friendship, or for any of the messy entanglements of life. He had built his world to be pristine and unyielding, a reflection of his own cold nature. Yet, as he sipped his whiskey, looking down at the glittering city beneath him, there was an emptiness he couldn't ignore. The feeling had been creeping up on him for months now, and no amount of money, power, or pleasure could chase it away. No matter how many business deals he closed, how many parties he attended, or how many women he charmed, it all felt hollow. Nothing seemed to fill the void. It was in the midst of his self-reflection that Julian Whitmore, his oldest and closest friend, appeared beside him. Julian, a tall man with a mischievous smile and a knack for stirring up trouble, was the one person in Sebastian's life who had never been intimidated by him. They had known each other since childhood, and though they were polar opposites in many ways, there was a bond between them that had stood the test of time. "Sebastian," Julian said, his voice smooth but carrying a challenge, "you look like a man who's won the world but still doesn't know what to do with it." Sebastian raised an eyebrow, studying his friend. "You know me too well, Julian," he replied with a smirk. "And yet, you still insist on dragging me to these parties." Julian laughed, unfazed. "What's the point of winning the world if you don't enjoy it? You've got all the money and power in the world, but no heart. You're a robot in a designer suit." Sebastian's lips twisted into a cynical smile. "I don't need a heart, Julian. I've got everything I need to succeed." Julian shook his head. "That's where you're wrong, my friend. No one can live like that forever. Eventually, even the most powerful man starts to wonder what it's all for. What's the point of all this, if you're just going to stare out at the world from a distance, never truly living in it?" Sebastian's gaze flickered to the room full of people. He was surrounded by the finest of society, yet he felt like a spectator, like a ghost walking among the living. But he didn't let it show. "I don't need your lectures, Julian. I know what I'm doing." Julian's eyes sparkled with an idea, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "All right then, let me challenge you. Let me show you something that will make you rethink your whole life." "A bet." Sebastian raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "A bet? What's this about?" Julian grinned, clearly enjoying the game he was about to play. "Here's the deal. You've got everything: money, power, prestige, but you're missing something. Something real. So, here's my proposition. You, Sebastian Hayes, marry a woman for 6 months. A woman who isn't like the ones you usually date. A woman who doesn't care about your money, your status, or your charm. You marry her, and you stick with it for 6 months. At the end of that time, we'll see if you've learned anything about life, about love, and about yourself." Sebastian's laughter was sharp and amused. "You're joking, right? You want me to marry a woman who doesn't care about me? You know that's impossible. No woman would ever agree to that. Not when I can have anyone I want." Julian's expression remained serious, his challenge unyielding. "That's the point, Sebastian. You've lived your whole life like you can buy anything and anyone. Now, I want to see you do something real. Something that can't be controlled with money. Marry a woman who doesn't want your wealth. Marry her for real. And if you fail, you admit I'm right. If you succeed, well, Maybe you'll finally figure out what it means to truly live. Sebastian was silent for a moment, weighing Julian's words. There was something about the challenge that stirred him, something that made him want to prove Julian wrong. He was used to winning, to being in control, and the idea of being forced into a situation where he couldn't simply buy his way out intrigued him. Finally, he looked at Julian, a smirk returning to his face. All right, I'll take your bet, but don't think for a second that I'll lose. Julian chuckled, his eyes gleaming with mischief. We'll see, Sebastian. We'll see. And just like that, the wager was set. Little did Sebastian know, the game he was about to play would change his life in ways he never could have imagined. The following days were filled with tension and anticipation. For Sebastian, the bet had become an obsession. He couldn't quite explain why, but Julian's words echoed in his mind, challenging his carefully constructed world. What was the point of everything if it was just a game? Could he really find someone who didn't care about his wealth, someone who would force him to confront the emptiness he felt deep down? The idea intrigued him more than he cared to admit. It was late one night when he found himself scrolling through social media on his phone, searching for someone who could fit the strange criteria Julian had set. A woman who would be completely uninterested in his wealth, yet strong enough to stand her ground. He wasn't expecting it to be easy, but the more he searched, the more he realized how hollow and predictable the women he usually surrounded himself with were. They were all interested in the same things: status, power, glamour. He needed something different. Someone who was immune to his charm and his money. That's when he saw her. Elena Carter. A quick glance at her profile painted a picture of someone unlike anyone he had ever met. A social worker in her mid-30s, she was clearly driven by purpose, not luxury. Her photographs were simple, unpolished, nothing like the curated perfection of the women he was used to. She didn't appear to be looking for anything from anyone. In fact, there was an air of independence about her that was both striking and intimidating. Her work with underprivileged families, the homeless, and children tugged at his curiosity, but it was her face, the seriousness in her eyes, that caught his attention. There was something in the way she looked at the world that told Sebastian she wouldn't be swayed by his money, by his power, or by his influence. She was a force of nature in a world of shallow illusions. The more he learned about her, the more he realized she was the perfect candidate. Elena was strong-willed, deeply committed to her cause, and completely unimpressed by anything he could offer. She wasn't looking for a savior, nor was she interested in becoming one of the many women who fluttered in and out of his life. She was as far removed from his usual type as one could be, which was precisely why Sebastian knew she would be his perfect challenge. He didn't waste time. He arranged a meeting at a quiet cafe in Brooklyn, far from the glitz and glamour of Manhattan, hoping to catch her off guard, away from her usual environment. He sat at a corner table, watching the door, his fingers drumming on the polished surface of the table. The last time he'd done something like this was years ago, back when he was still trying to find some semblance of meaning in a world of wealth and excess. But those feelings had long since faded. Now, it was all about the game. When Elena walked in, she immediately struck him as different. There was no hesitation in her steps, no trace of awe in her gaze when she saw him. Unlike the countless women who practically bowed before his presence, Elena was unflinching, her expression neutral, as though he was just another man sitting at a table. He couldn't help but feel intrigued. She approached with purpose, sitting across from him with a directness that made him momentarily uneasy. Her dark eyes studied him, as though evaluating him with an almost clinical precision. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth, nor was she overly impressed by his reputation. She simply was. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady. "I assume you didn't ask to meet me here just for coffee." Sebastian smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Straight to the point. I like that." "I don't have time for games," Elena replied, her tone neither warm nor cold, simply firm. "So, why don't you tell me what this is really about?" He paused, gauging her reaction before speaking. "I'll get straight to it. I want to make you an offer." Elena raised an eyebrow but didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. "I'm aware of your work with Rise Up, the charity you run for struggling families. I want to help," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. I'd like to make a donation, a substantial one, but with one condition. Of course, she said, already skeptical. There's always a condition when it comes to you, isn't there? Sebastian's smile didn't falter. In exchange for the funding, I'd like to enter into a marriage contract with you. Elena leaned back, her gaze sharpening. Excuse me? He didn't flinch, his eyes locked on hers, confident in his words. I'm not asking for a traditional marriage. Think of it as a partnership. A contractual arrangement where you receive funding for your charity in exchange for being married to me for 6 months. You'll have all the financial resources you need to further your cause, and I'll gain some positive press. A win-win. Her face was unreadable, but the tension in the air was palpable. She took a moment to process his words, her fingers tapping on the table in thought. And why would I do this? She finally asked, her voice laced with disbelief. You want me to marry you. Why? So you can continue your game of manipulation while pretending to care about my work? Sebastian was taken aback by her directness. Most women would have jumped at the chance for financial security, for a life of luxury. But Elena wasn't like the others. It's not about manipulation. I'm offering you the funds to help people who need it. You've dedicated your life to your charity. This is an opportunity to do more than you ever could alone. Elena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, as if searching for any trace of honesty in his words. Her expression softened slightly, but only enough for Sebastian to catch the shift. All right, she said finally, but I'm doing this for the charity, not for you. And don't think for a second that I'll let you treat this like another one of your games. Sebastian's heart raced for the first time in years. He had just crossed into unfamiliar territory. He had no idea what he had just agreed to, but for the first time, he wasn't in control, and that made him more eager than ever to see where this would go. The following weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and formalities, but the arrangement was set. Sebastian had drawn up the contract with the cold efficiency of a man used to controlling every detail of his life. The marriage was to be strictly professional, with clearly defined terms. 6 months, no romantic entanglements, and full access to the financial support that Elena's charity desperately needed. It was a deal that would benefit them both. At least, that's what Sebastian told himself. On the day of the wedding, Sebastian's penthouse was filled with the usual glamour. Luxury cars lined the streets below, guests mingled with flutes of champagne in hand, and the finest chefs prepared elaborate dishes to be served later. But despite the grandeur, something felt different. This was not a marriage of love or even genuine partnership. It was a transaction, a game, and Sebastian's mind was focused solely on the prize at the end. Winning the bet. Elena, however, was not fazed by any of it. She entered the penthouse with an air of calm determination, unaffected by the opulence surrounding her. Her dress, simple yet elegant, contrasted sharply with the extravagance of the event. She was not here to be swept away by the spectacle. She was here to fulfill her end of the bargain, and nothing more. As the ceremony began, Elena stood beside Sebastian, her face an unreadable mask. The words exchanged between them felt mechanical, rehearsed. There was no love in their vows, no shared connection. She had agreed to this arrangement for the sake of her charity. Nothing else mattered. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but she refused to let the pressure get to her. She had been through far harder things in her life than standing at the altar of a man who didn't know her, and she wouldn't let this be any different. Sebastian, on the other hand, found himself oddly captivated by her composure. He had expected her to be nervous, perhaps even impressed by the setting, but instead, she stood tall, her back straight and her gaze focused on the future. There was something about her strength that intrigued him, something he hadn't expected from a woman who had so little in terms of material wealth. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, it felt more like a formality than a life-changing moment. The guests applauded, and the photographers captured every meticulously arranged detail, but the reality of the situation was stark and unromantic. Elena offered a polite smile, but it was clear she wasn't here to enjoy the celebrations. She had come for one reason only, to ensure that her charity would flourish. Later that evening, as the party swirled around them, Sebastian led Elena through the crowd, showing her off like a prize. just another part of his well-oiled machine of public relations. He introduced her to the influential people he'd spent years cultivating, each interaction calculated and precise. Elena, however, remained distant, her responses polite but uninterested. The whole evening felt like a performance, and she was no more a part of it than a mannequin dressed in the finest clothes. It wasn't until they reached the private elevator to the penthouse that the cracks in their newly forged marriage began to show. Elena had made it clear from the start that she wouldn't be sharing a bedroom with Sebastian. There would be no pretense of intimacy, no fake closeness. She wasn't here to play the part of the perfect wife. Sebastian, despite himself, was slightly irritated by her refusal to adhere to even the most basic expectations of their arrangement. In all the years he had dominated the social scene, he had never encountered someone who defied him so effortlessly. The women he dated fell in line with his wishes, eager to please him and bask in the glow of his wealth. Elena, however, seemed impervious to his charms and unaffected by his status. "You know," he said as they stepped into the elevator, his voice laced with amusement, "this marriage is supposed to be a partnership, Elena. That means you're going to have to play along at some point." Elena met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "I'm playing along, Sebastian, but only on my terms. I'm not here to be your trophy wife or your arm candy for gala after gala. I'm here to help my charity, and that's it." The elevator doors slid shut with a soft ding, and the silence between them was thick with unspoken tension. Sebastian couldn't decide if he was frustrated or intrigued. The women he usually interacted with would have jumped at the chance to bask in the luxury he offered. Elena, however, wasn't interested in his wealth or his influence. She was only interested in what he could provide to the families who depended on her charity. When they reached the top floor, Sebastian led her down the hallway to his penthouse. He had prepared a guest suite for her, just as he had promised. She would not be staying in his bedroom. He would ensure that. There was no point in pretending otherwise. He wanted nothing more than to maintain control of the situation, to win the bet and show Julian that he could bend anyone to his will. But Elena had other plans. She moved toward the door of the guest suite and turned to him. "Good night, Mr. Hayes," she said simply, her tone polite but firm. Sebastian couldn't help but watch her leave, a part of him feeling strangely unsettled. He was used to women hanging on his every word, following his lead, but Elena was different. She didn't need him, didn't want him, and that, more than anything, made her more captivating than any woman he had ever known. As he stood there, staring at the door, the reality of what he had just entered into began to settle in. This wasn't just a game anymore. There was something about Elena that was making him question everything he thought he knew about himself. And for the first time in years, he wondered what it would be like to lose control. The days after the wedding were an odd mixture of cold politeness and fleeting moments of discomfort. Sebastian was used to being the center of attention, the one who commanded every room he entered. Yet, with Elena, he felt as though he were the one being observed. She maintained a steady distance, both physically and emotionally. The contrast between them couldn't have been more glaring, and though Sebastian tried to push it aside, it gnawed at him. It wasn't until Elena suggested taking him to her charity center, Rise Up, that he saw an opportunity to bring her into his world, on his terms. It was, after all, one of the conditions he had set for this arrangement. She would accompany him to his high society events, and he, in turn, would visit her charitable ventures. Perhaps by stepping into her world, he could understand her better, maybe even impress her with his influence and connections. But Rise Up was nothing like the glamorous galas Sebastian was used to attending. Located in one of the city's most struggling neighborhoods, it was a modest building tucked between rundown stores and apartments. The outside had peeling paint, and the entrance was worn from years of heavy use. The moment Sebastian stepped out of his sleek black car, he felt the stark contrast between his polished image and the raw, real-world Elena occupied. He could feel the eyes of the people there on him as he followed Elena into the building. Some were curious, others skeptical. He was used to being noticed, but here, it wasn't for the reasons he was accustomed to. These people weren't looking at him because of his wealth or reputation. They were looking at him as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. Elena, however, walked through the space with the ease of someone who had worked here for years. She exchanged warm greetings with the staff, asked about the children who had come in for help, and quickly rolled up her sleeves, offering to take over a few tasks herself. Her presence was magnetic. She didn't need the luxury of Sebastian's world to command respect. She had earned it here, through hard work, dedication, and a genuine care for the people she served. Sebastian stood near the back of the room, watching her with a mix of admiration and discomfort. He had never been in a place like this before. The poverty, the desperation, the children who lacked the most basic necessities. It was a far cry from the perfectly curated image of success that he was used to. His entire life had been about striving for more, accumulating wealth and power. To him, success was something to be measured in numbers, in deals, in properties. The people here, however, seemed to define success by a different standard, by what they gave, not what they could take. "How do you do it?" Sebastian asked quietly, unable to tear his eyes away from a young mother sitting on a bench, cradling a malnourished baby in her arms. The woman looked exhausted, her face drawn and weary, but she smiled at Elena with a deep sense of trust and gratitude. Elena glanced over at him, her expression unreadable. "How do I do what?" "Live like this," he asked, gesturing vaguely around the room. "How do you deal with all of it? The constant need, the overwhelming reality of it?" She hesitated, then walked over to a small desk where a few volunteers were sorting donations. She leaned against it, folding her arms, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "I do it because it matters. Every small thing we do here makes a difference. Whether it's providing food for a child or offering advice to a struggling mother, it all adds up. It's not about money. It's about making sure people have a chance to rebuild." Sebastian couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt stir within him. For all his wealth and all his power, he had never truly understood the kind of struggle these people faced on a daily basis. He had been taught to believe that success was something that could be bought, something that could be achieved through sheer willpower and the accumulation of wealth. But here, in this building filled with people who had so little, success was measured in something far more intangible. As they moved through the center, Elena introduced him to several families, each with their own story of hardship. He listened, somewhat detached at first, but slowly, something inside him began to shift. He was no longer observing them as if they were just part of a spectacle. He started to hear their stories, the struggles of single mothers who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, children who had never known a stable home, men and women who had lost hope. It wasn't until they reached the back of the center that Sebastian's perspective truly began to change. A young woman, no older than 20, was sitting in a corner with a baby in her arms, crying softly. Elena approached her, speaking gently in a language Sebastian didn't understand. The woman looked up, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Elena sat down beside her, speaking with a calm assurance, as if she had been through this kind of thing 100 times before. "Her name's Maria," Elena explained once she had finished speaking to the woman. "She came in this morning. Her boyfriend kicked her out after she had the baby. She's nowhere to go. No family, no friends. And she's afraid she's going to lose her child." Sebastian felt something twist in his chest as he looked at the young mother, her fear and uncertainty radiating from her. He had seen people like her before, but never up close. Never like this. He had always seen the poor as something abstract, a problem to be solved, a distant issue to be dealt with from behind a desk or a closed office door. But this was real. This was human. "Can we help her?" he asked, his voice almost tentative. Elena turned to him, her expression softening for the first time that day. "We're doing what we can. We'll find a safe place for her and her baby. We'll get her back on her feet." Sebastian nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling on him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was in control. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know what the next step was. But he knew one thing for certain. He wanted to help. And that desire, that spark of empathy, was something he hadn't felt in years. The weeks that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions for Sebastian. The glitz and glamour of his high society life seemed to lose some of its luster every time he stepped away from it. His time with Elena at the community center had begun to change something deep within him, something he couldn't quite put into words. He tried to push these feelings aside, to remind himself that this was just a game. It was a bet, a way to prove his control over his life. But even as he told himself this, he couldn't ignore the shift that had started within him. Sebastian had always been the one to control everything in his world. He was used to getting what he wanted, when he wanted it. His world was structured, predictable, and, above all, comfortable. But Elena had shattered that comfortable bubble. She didn't seek validation from him, didn't care for his wealth, and, perhaps most frustrating of all, didn't seem to care for him in the way he was accustomed to being cared for. His usual methods for getting people to like him, flashing money, making grand gestures, and showcasing his influence, didn't work with Elena. The more he tried, the more she resisted. And every time she refused to be impressed or intimidated by him, it only made him want to try harder. To prove that his world had value, Sebastian took her to a series of high-profile charity galas, events where the city's elite mingled in their finest attire, exchanging promises of goodwill and mingling under the glamorous lights. He had hoped that by bringing Elena into these settings, she would see the other side of his world, the world where his money and connections could truly make a difference. But Elena wasn't fooled. She didn't care about the extravagant parties, the designer gowns, or the glimmering speeches that held no substance. When they arrived at the first gala together, she was uncharacteristically silent, observing the artificial conversations around her with quiet disdain. She refused to mingle, preferring instead to stand by his side, with an almost imperceptible expression of judgment on her face. "I'm not here to play your games, Sebastian," she finally said, her voice firm, cutting through the superficial chatter around them. "This isn't what I do. Charity isn't about showing off to the world. It's about making a real impact. It's about changing lives, not posing for the cameras." Sebastian felt a jolt of frustration course through him. He hadn't expected her to be so blunt, to so openly reject the very world that he had spent years cultivating. He tried to push back. "Elena, you're missing the point," he said, his voice tight. "These people have the resources to make things happen. Without their backing, the center you run wouldn't exist. This is how it works: fundraising, networking, cultivating relationships." She looked at him then, her eyes full of a mixture of pity and disbelief. "But it's all so hollow, Sebastian. These people are playing at charity, pretending to care about the world while sipping champagne and congratulating themselves. True charity isn't about who you know or how much you can give for a tax break. It's about rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty. It's about sacrifice and giving what you can, no matter how little it may seem." The words hit him harder than he expected. A deep sense of discomfort washed over him. He had spent years playing the part of the philanthropist, donating millions, hosting galas, giving speeches about changing the world. But as Elena's words sank in, he realized that he had never truly understood what it meant to help. He had been doing it for the image, for the prestige, for the show. As they left the gala that night, Elena was quieter than usual, but there was a cool detachment in her demeanor that he hadn't seen before. She no longer seemed to care whether he understood her world. She had made her point, and she had no intention of playing along with his. Sebastian couldn't shake her words. True charity wasn't about prestige, it was about real impact. He replayed them in his mind over and over, and for the first time in a long while, he questioned his own motives. The next day, he found himself back at the community center, this time without Elena. He had told her he would meet her there, but a last-minute work issue had delayed her arrival. In the meantime, he walked through the rooms, observing everything with a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. He watched a young woman who had been there for weeks, trying to regain custody of her children. She sat at a table, sorting through paperwork, her hands trembling as she filled out forms. A few children ran around in the corner, their laughter filling the room as they played. In the kitchen, volunteers were preparing meals for families in need. Everything about the space felt real, tangible. Sebastian had been blind to it before, so focused on his own world that he couldn't see what truly mattered. But now, as he stood there, watching the people work, he felt something shift inside of him. The struggle of these people was no longer an abstract concept. It was a reality. And Elena, despite her rough exterior, was doing everything she could to make sure they didn't face it alone. When Elena finally arrived, he didn't say anything at first. Instead, he simply walked over to the counter, grabbed a pair of gloves, and began helping the volunteers prepare lunch. She raised an eyebrow at him, but didn't comment. For the rest of the afternoon, he worked alongside her. The conversations were few, but the connection between them deepened in a way he couldn't explain. He found himself engaged, not because of the status of the people around him, but because of the people themselves. Their stories, their struggles, their strength. It all mattered to him now. As the sun began to set and the center started to empty, Elena finally approached him. "You're still here," she remarked, her voice softer than usual. Sebastian looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I thought I'd stay for a while." "You were right, Elena. About everything." She studied him, her eyes searching his face for signs of sincerity. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "I've spent my whole life focused on the wrong things," he said quietly. "Chasing power, chasing money. I thought those things could solve everything, but they don't. You were right. Real change comes from being here, from doing the work." Elena looked at him for a long time, her eyes softening slightly. "I didn't expect you to get it so quickly, but I'm glad you're starting to understand." He smiled faintly, his gaze meeting hers. "I have a lot to learn, but I'm willing to try." The moment lingered between them, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted, something important. It wasn't just about the bed anymore. It was about something real, something Sebastian hadn't been able to name until now. But he was ready to learn, ready to understand. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to change. Sebastian had never truly understood the meaning of sacrifice. He had seen it from a distance, read about it in charity brochures, or heard about it at galas, but he had never experienced it. He had never had to give up something of his own in order to help someone else. His world had been one of excess, where problems were solved with money, where issues were smoothed over with a few well-placed donations. But that world was beginning to feel more distant now, as the days went by and his time at the community center became less of an obligation and more of a necessity. At first, it had been a way to show Elena he was willing to play along, a way to prove that he could do the right thing when he wanted to. But soon, the faces of the people he met there, the young mother struggling to make ends meet, the elderly man in need of medical care, the children who had no place to call home, began to haunt him in ways he hadn't expected. It was the young mother that changed everything. Her name was Lucy, and she had recently given birth to a beautiful baby girl. She was one of the many mothers the center tried to help, but her situation was dire. Lucy was living in a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town, and her income from a low-paying job at a local diner barely covered the basics. When she came to the center, her eyes were red-rimmed from sleepless nights and worry, and her hands trembled as she held her newborn. "I just need somewhere safe for my baby to sleep," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this alone." Sebastian watched as Elena gently took Lucy's hands in hers, comforting her with words that were soft but firm. He couldn't help but notice the raw emotion in Elena's eyes as she spoke with the woman, an emotion he had never seen in himself. There was a strength there, a deep well of empathy that came from years of caring for others, of understanding what it meant to sacrifice for the sake of someone else. Sebastian found himself watching them both, a quiet unease settling in his chest. He had spent so much of his life focused on power, control, and status, that he had never allowed himself to feel the depth of someone else's struggle. But as he stood there, in that small, cramped room, he realized that Lucy's pain was real, and it was something he could help with. He looked over at Elena, who was now speaking to Lucy about the resources available to her through the center. For the first time, he didn't just see her as the woman he had married as part of a bet. He saw her as someone who was making a real difference in the world, someone who had the power to change lives. And he realized that he wanted to be a part of that. Later that afternoon, as Elena sat at her desk, going over some paperwork, Sebastian approached her quietly. She looked up at him, her eyes soft but guarded. She had always been cautious around him, and for good reason. He had been a stranger to her in every sense of the word. But now, there was something different in his eyes. "I want to help," he said simply. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they were true. I've been thinking, I want to do more than just write a check. I want to be involved. I want to help Lucy. I want to help all of them. Elena regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Sebastian couldn't tell if she was skeptical, surprised, or perhaps both. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of hope, maybe, that made him believe that, just maybe, she was starting to see the change in him. You don't have to do this, she said softly, but there was a certain warmth in her voice. You don't owe me anything, Sebastian. This is your choice. I know, he said, his voice steady now, but it's not just about you. It's about them, about giving back. I've spent my life building a reputation based on what I have, not who I am. And I don't want to live like that anymore. I want to make a real difference. Elena stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, finally, she nodded. If you're serious, then let's do this. But it's not going to be easy. It's not about throwing money at a problem and hoping it goes away. It's about showing up, day after day. It's about hard work. Sebastian smiled, genuinely this time. I'm ready. From that day forward, he was a regular presence at the center. He began working with the volunteers, helping organize donations, and even sitting down with the families who came seeking help. The more time he spent there, the more he understood the work Elena was doing. He began to see the people who came to the center not as charity cases, but as real people with real stories, real struggles, and real potential. He watched as a young girl named Sarah, who had been coming to the center for a year, graduated from high school with honors. Her dream was to become a teacher, and with the support of the center and Elena's unwavering belief in her, she was able to attend college. Sebastian couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he watched Sarah walk across the stage to receive her diploma. It was the kind of pride he had never felt at a gala or business meeting. This was real. This was meaningful. But it was the conversation with Elena that changed everything for him. One evening, as the two of them were sitting in her office, going over plans for the center's upcoming fundraiser, Sebastian spoke up. I didn't expect to feel like this. I didn't expect to care so much. Elena looked at him, her eyes soft. It's not about expectations, Sebastian. It's about doing the right thing. Sometimes, you don't realize how much you can change until you actually start trying. He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. I've spent my whole life running away from things I didn't want to face. But now I'm ready to face them. Elena didn't speak, but her eyes met his with an understanding that went deeper than words. She had always known that Sebastian had the potential to change, but now, he was doing it. And as he sat there, in the small, humble office of the Rise Up Center, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and hope, Sebastian Hayes realized that he had found something he had never known he needed: purpose. Real purpose. Sebastian had always been a man who operated within the confines of his own world, where things were predictable, controlled, and, above all, efficient. But as the weeks passed, he began to find himself straying further from the man he once was. His mind, once consumed by stock market fluctuations and business ventures, was now occupied with thoughts of the families he met at the center, of the single mothers who struggled to make ends meet, and the children who had never known the stability of a home. He was no longer merely a visitor to Rise Up. He was becoming an integral part of it. His actions, once driven by pride and ego, had transformed into genuine acts of support. He wasn't just there because it made him look good. He was there because he wanted to help, and it felt different. One afternoon, after spending hours organizing supplies for the upcoming food drive, Sebastian found himself sitting with Elena in the small break room at the center. They had been working side by side for weeks now, and despite the barriers they had once built between them, something had shifted. Their conversations had moved beyond mere politeness and into a space of mutual respect. I never thought I'd see the day where I'd be helping to sort canned goods, Sebastian said, a wry smile on his face as he wiped his brow. I thought I'd be at some gala or making another deal. Elena laughed softly, but there was a warmth in her eyes. Sometimes, the things that make the biggest difference aren't the things that come with a price tag or a spotlight. It's the things that come with time, effort, and heart. He nodded, the truth of her words sinking deeper into his consciousness. In the past, he had been driven by accolades, awards, and recognition. But now, as he watched families come in for the food drive, some carrying nothing but their hope, others carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, he realized that this was where the real change happened. But despite his transformation, there was still a part of him that couldn't escape the world he came from. He still felt the pull of the business deals, the allure of luxury, and the comforts of his penthouse. He had come so far, but there were moments when his old self resurfaced, like a shadow lurking just out of sight, reminding him of everything he had once been. It was one of those moments that led to his first real confrontation with Elena. They were in the middle of a planning meeting for the center's next fundraiser when Sebastian brought up an idea that, to him, seemed like a natural fit. We could bring in some big-name sponsors, people who have the funds to really elevate this event. I'm sure I could get a few of my business contacts on board. We could make this a huge event, one that would attract serious attention. Elena looked up at him, her brow furrowing. We don't need to attract attention for the sake of prestige, Sebastian. We need to attract attention because of the cause. The people who come here need to know that we are about helping them, not about putting on a show. Sebastian's lips pressed into a thin line. He had meant well. He had thought that the prestige would draw more resources, more attention to the cause. But Elena wasn't seeing it the same way. I'm not suggesting we turn this into a celebrity circus, he said, his tone more defensive than he had intended. I just think that if we get the right people involved, we can do more good. We can make a bigger impact. I'm sure you can, Elena replied, her voice steady but sharp. But that's not why we're here. We're here because we believe in the people who come through those doors. If they're going to be a part of this, it has to be because they believe in the mission, not because they want to rub elbows with the rich and powerful. There was silence between them, a tension that neither had anticipated. For a moment, Sebastian felt as if he were standing on the edge of his old world and the new one he was beginning to embrace. The world of glittering events and influential contacts seemed so distant in the face of Elena's unwavering commitment to the center's mission. He stood up abruptly, pacing across the small room. I'm not trying to undermine you, Elena. I'm just trying to make a difference in my own way. I'm trying to help. I know you're trying, she said quietly, her voice softening. But sometimes, trying too hard to control things can make them worse. This isn't your world, Sebastian. And it doesn't need to be. You don't have to fix everything with money or influence. Sometimes, just being present, just showing up, is enough. His gaze softened as he turned back toward her. He hadn't meant to make her feel like he was trying to take over. He wasn't sure how to navigate this new world he was in. But one thing was clear. Elena's world wasn't about grandeur. It was about simplicity and genuine care. I get it, he said after a long pause. I do. Elena nodded, offering him a small but genuine smile. I know you do. It's just hard, sometimes, to step outside of what you've always known. He let out a deep breath. I'll try to do better, to understand better. She met his gaze, and for the first time, Sebastian felt something he hadn't felt in years. The urge to change not just for the sake of change, but because he truly wanted to be better. The next few days were pivotal in Sebastian's journey. He began stepping back from his old ways, no more trying to use connections for the sake of prestige. Instead, he focused on what truly mattered. He began meeting with families in need, listening to their stories, and offering support not as a billionaire with an agenda, but as a person who wanted to make a genuine difference. His transformation didn't happen overnight, but with every passing day, he found himself shedding pieces of the old Sebastian Hayes, the one who cared only about himself. The one who never really understood what it meant to help others, to give without expecting anything in return. And as his world slowly shifted, so did the way Elena saw him. She could still be cautious. After all, there were parts of him she couldn't forget. But she was beginning to see that the man sitting beside her, working to make the world a better place, was different. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that, she realized, was enough. Sebastian had never been one to show vulnerability. For most of his life, he had built walls around himself, emotional barricades that protected him from the harshness of the world. But the man who stood now in the middle of the small break room at Rise Up was a far cry from the one who had walked into Elena's life months ago. The transformation was undeniable, But there was something else now, an emptiness, a gnawing void that had taken root inside him. He stared out of the window, watching the sunlight filter through the dusty glass. The sounds of the city outside were a constant reminder of the life he had once lived, one filled with power, wealth, and endless distractions. And yet, now, the noise of the city felt like a distant hum, fading into the background as the weight of what he was feeling consumed him. Elena was sitting across from him, silently observing him. She had been quiet ever since they'd finished organizing the donations for the day. There was a sense of distance between them, one that hadn't existed before. For all the progress they had made, for all the changes he had undergone, there was still something unspoken between them, a tension that neither of them seemed ready to address. Finally, unable to stand the silence any longer, Sebastian broke it. "I was wrong, Elena," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "For so long, I believed that money could solve everything, that it could buy happiness, buy love, buy everything I needed. But the truth is it never did." She didn't respond right away, her gaze softening as she studied him. The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Sebastian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wasn't used to admitting his flaws, to confronting the ugly truths about himself. But here, in this moment, he couldn't hide from them anymore. "I've been so focused on building my empire, on winning at all costs, that I never stopped to consider the people around me. The ones who actually need help, not just money and power, but real connection." He paused, swallowing the bitterness that threatened to rise in his throat. "I've been selfish, Elena. All my life, I've been selfish." Elena's eyes softened, but there was still a guarded look in them. She had seen glimpses of the man he was becoming, but she wasn't sure if she could trust him just yet. She had been hurt before, and it wasn't easy for her to let her guard down, even if she saw the sincerity in his words. "I don't know how to fix everything," he continued, his voice shaking slightly, betraying the vulnerability he was trying so hard to suppress. "I don't even know if I can, but I want to try. I want to learn what it means to be, not just a businessman, but a person who actually makes a difference." Elena sat in silence, absorbing his words. Her heart was torn between the hurt of the past and the possibility of a future that might be different. It wasn't just about the bed anymore. It wasn't even about Sebastian's wealth or his past arrogance. It was about who he was becoming, and that was the hardest part for her. The uncertainty of whether this change was real or just another phase he would eventually outgrow. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Sebastian said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "But I need you to know that I care about what happens here, about the people we're helping. I care about you." The silence stretched between them, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world had stopped spinning. Elena felt a lump form in her throat as she stared at him. She had never imagined this moment, never imagined that the man who had come into her life so arrogantly, so wrapped up in his own world, would be standing here, pouring out his heart. But despite his words, despite the vulnerability in his eyes, there was still a nagging feeling at the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the doubt that lingered. Was he really changing, or was this just another game he was playing? Another way to win her over, to prove that he could have everything he wanted? "I don't know what you want from me, Sebastian," Elena finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "You say you've changed, but I don't know if I can believe it yet." "I don't want anything from you, Elena," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I just want you to see that I'm trying. I want you to see me for who I am now, not the man I was." The words hung in the air, and Elena felt her walls slowly beginning to crumble. There was sincerity in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this change was real. But even as hope flickered inside her, a sharp pain stabbed through her chest. She couldn't forget the betrayal, the fact that she had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. The wound was still fresh, and the scar it had left was not something that could be easily healed with words, no matter how genuine they seemed. "I can't promise you anything," she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But I'll give you a chance. Not because I trust you yet, but because, maybe, you deserve that chance." Sebastian felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tempered with the understanding that this was just the beginning. He had a long road ahead of him, one filled with uncertainty and doubt. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to walk it. Not for a bet, not for a challenge, but for himself and for Elena. The next few weeks were filled with small, meaningful changes. Sebastian continued his work at the center, his involvement growing deeper with each passing day. He used his resources not to impress, but to make real, lasting differences in the lives of the people who came to rise up. He started meeting with families, helping them with housing, jobs, and healthcare. He didn't do it for a tax write-off, and he didn't do it for the applause. He did it because he wanted to be a part of something bigger than himself. But despite all of this, despite his growing commitment, the question still lingered. Was it enough? Could it ever be enough to undo the hurt he had caused? As Sebastian sat alone in his penthouse one evening, the silence around him felt more profound than ever before. He had everything he could ever want, except for one thing: her. The revelation came like a slap to the face. It wasn't the kind of truth that could be easily ignored, the kind that would fade with time. No, this was a truth that cut through Sebastian's carefully constructed world, leaving jagged wounds in its wake. He had been so sure of his control, so certain that he had somehow managed to change things, that he had truly begun to care about Rise Up and the families they were helping, that he had evolved beyond the arrogant billionaire who once thought he could buy everything. But just as things seemed to be heading towards some semblance of peace, the reality of his past came crashing back into his life. Julian Whitmore, the man who had started this whole mess, appeared out of nowhere, showing up at Rise Up with a look in his eyes that could only be described as smug satisfaction. It was the kind of look that made Sebastian's skin crawl. "Sebastian," Julian greeted him casually, as though the months of silence between them hadn't existed. "It's good to see you again." Sebastian stiffened, his pulse quickening. He had been trying so hard to bury the past, to leave the bet and the game behind. But here Julian was, bringing it all back to the surface. "I thought you'd forgotten about me," Sebastian said, his voice colder than he intended. Julian chuckled, clearly unfazed. "I could never forget about you, my old friend. Besides, you owe me something, don't you?" The words hit Sebastian like a freight train. The bet, the whole reason he was here, sitting at this table with Elena, working to change his life, had been nothing but a game for Julian. And now, that game was about to shatter everything. Elena, who had been sitting in the corner, overhearing the conversation, froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pieced it together. She had suspected, deep down, that there was more to Sebastian's motivations than he had let on. She had felt it, the guardedness in his actions, the hesitations in his words. And now, it was all becoming clear. Julian's smirk widened as he turned to her. "You're Elena, right? The charity worker? Well, I hope you've been enjoying your time in Sebastian's little game." You see, this was all just a bet for him, a bet he's yet to win. Elena's stomach churned. She didn't want to hear it, but she had to. She needed to know the truth. Sebastian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor as he rounded on Julian. "You need to leave. Now." His voice was tight with anger, but there was an unmistakable tremor in his words. But Julian wasn't intimidated. He shrugged, leaning back in his seat with a smirk. "Oh, come on, Sebastian. Don't act like this wasn't the plan all along. You bet me you couldn't marry a woman outside your usual type for 6 months. And now, here we are. Look at how it's all turned out." The words hit Elena like a gut punch. It was as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. The man she had begun to care for, the man she had believed was different, had played her from the start. It was all a lie, a sick joke at her expense. Her voice shook as she spoke, the words barely a whisper. You lied to me?" Sebastian felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. He had prepared for this moment in 100 different ways, but nothing could have prepared him for the look on Elena's face. The betrayal, the hurt, the disbelief. She had trusted him, and he had broken that trust. No amount of money or power could fix what he had done now. "I didn't mean for it to go like this," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought I could win the bet and get it over with. But everything changed. You changed me, Elena." Her eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. She was stronger than that. She wasn't going to let him see her crumble. Not now. "You think you can just say that and it makes everything okay?" Elena asked, her voice sharp, though it trembled with the pain she was trying to suppress. "You thought this was all just a game, a bet, a challenge. But you were playing with my life, Sebastian, my heart. And for what?" Sebastian felt the weight of her words, each one sinking deeper into him than he cared to admit. He had tried so hard to prove that he wasn't the man he used to be. But in the end, he had become a reflection of that man once again. "I didn't know how to fix it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could help. I thought I could show you I wasn't just a billionaire playing games. But I wasn't ready to face the consequences of my actions. Not until now." Julian, sensing the tension in the room, stood up and casually dusted off his coat. "Well, this has been fun, but I think it's time I take my leave." His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he looked at Sebastian one last time. "Don't say I didn't warn you. The truth always comes out in the end." With that, Julian exited the room, leaving Sebastian standing there, paralyzed by the aftermath of his own mistakes. For a long moment, there was only silence. Elena didn't know what to say, how to process everything that had just happened. She had come to care about Sebastian, but now everything felt like a lie. Finally, she spoke, her voice broken but steady. "I can't do this. I can't be a part of this anymore, Sebastian. I can't be your charity project. I'm not some prize for you to win. I deserve more than that." Her words stung. They pierced him in ways he couldn't articulate. But he knew she was right. "I'll leave," he said quietly. "I'll make sure the funding for Rise Up continues, and I'll make sure the families here are taken care of. But you deserve someone who will love you for you. Not because they're trying to prove something to themselves." Elena shook her head. "I don't know who you are anymore." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Sebastian alone in the room. His heart ached, but he couldn't stop it. He had destroyed the one thing he had cared about, and there was no easy way to fix it. Sebastian stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where Elena had just been. He had thought he was in control of everything, but now, he realized that control had always been an illusion, and it was slipping away faster than he could hold on. Sebastian stood in the cold, empty room of the Rise Up Charity Center, long after Elena had walked out. The silence felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him. He had no idea how to fix what he had broken, but deep down, he knew that this moment, this feeling of total loss, was something he had never experienced before. He had always been the one in control, always the one with the power, the wealth, the influence. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. His mind raced as he replayed everything in his head. How had he been so blind? How had he allowed a bet, a game, to take precedence over something as real as the connection he had started to feel for Elena? He had told himself he was trying to help, trying to change. But in the end, it was all just about proving a point to Julian, to himself. And Elena had been the one who paid the price. With a sigh, he left the charity center and walked into the cool night air. The streets of Manhattan, usually so alive with energy, seemed distant and cold now. He barely registered the cars, the crowds, the sounds of the city. His mind was elsewhere. His heart was somewhere far away, where Elena was. Days passed in a haze for Sebastian. The meetings, the business deals, the parties, all felt like background noise to the reality that had unfolded. He had tried to drown out the guilt, the shame, with work, with distractions, but nothing could erase the weight of his actions. Nothing could erase the way Elena had looked at him that day, hurt, betrayed, as though she had been utterly deceived. He spent hours at the charity center, not as a billionaire looking to prove something, but as someone trying to make amends. He wasn't doing it for the cameras or for the headlines. He wasn't doing it for Elena, at least not at first. He was doing it because he had seen, for the first time, what truly mattered. The families, the children, the people who had no safety net. He couldn't change the past, but he could help change the future. Every day, he worked alongside Elena's team, doing the small tasks he had once thought beneath him. Sorting donations, meeting with community leaders, setting up support programs. Slowly, he began to understand the depth of what Elena had been doing all along, the genuine difference she was making in people's lives. And slowly, his heart began to change, too. Then, one morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the city, a message came through on his phone. It was a simple text from Elena. "I've been watching. I see what you're doing. But you've got a long way to go." It was a small thing, but to Sebastian, it meant the world. It meant she hadn't completely written him off. She saw that he was trying, finally, truly trying. A few days later, he decided to take another step. He needed to show Elena that his transformation wasn't just about making up for the bet. It was about proving to her that he could be a better man, not just for her, but for the people who needed him. He arranged a private meeting with the board of Rise Up. The plan was simple. He wanted to secure a long-term partnership, not as a sponsor, but as a true partner, someone who was committed to the cause, not for publicity, but because it was the right thing to do. When Elena arrived, she was surprised to see him in the room, standing beside her team. No fanfare, no press. Just him, serious, focused, and ready to make a real difference. "I've been thinking," Sebastian began, his voice steady, "about how I can help in a way that's meaningful. Not because it looks good, but because it's right. I want to contribute, not just for the short term, but for the future. I want to invest in this center, in this community, and in people's lives. I don't need recognition, but I need to know I've done something that counts." Elena stared at him, her expression unreadable. She had no idea what had led him to this point, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes. She could see that he wasn't just offering empty words, but a real commitment. But still, something inside her hesitated. There was a part of her that wasn't ready to forgive. She wasn't sure if she ever could. "Why are you doing this, Sebastian?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and caution. "After everything? After everything you did? Why now?" He met her gaze, his expression softened by the weight of the truth. "Because I finally understand. I've been blind for so long, thinking money and power could fix everything. But they don't. I've realized that what really matters is making a difference in people's lives, your life, the lives of these families. I want to be someone who contributes to that, not just takes from it. I can't change what I did, but I can change who I am. And I need you to know that." For a moment, Elena just stood there, the weight of his words settling over her. She wanted to believe him, but could she? Could she truly believe that the man standing before her was the same one who had once lied and manipulated her for a bet? She didn't know. But there was one thing she did know. He was trying. And that, at least, was a start. Elena exhaled slowly, her shoulders loosening for the first time in days. "We'll see if you really mean it," she said, her voice softer than before. Sebastian nodded. "I'll prove it. I won't stop. I can't." For the first time in a long while, Elena felt a small spark of hope, not for a fairy tale romance or for some grand gesture of love, but for the possibility that people could change, sometimes, when they truly wanted to. And maybe, just maybe, Sebastian Hayes had changed. Weeks passed, and the air between Sebastian and Elena was thick with unspoken tension, but also something else, something tentative, fragile, yet undeniable. Elena continued her work at Rise Up, watching as Sebastian, at first an outsider, slowly integrated into the day-to-day activities of the center. He wasn't always the most comfortable or the most skilled at certain tasks, but he was there, showing up, putting in the effort, and often staying late into the night, crunching numbers or planning strategies for the next fundraising event. And though his presence still made her uneasy, Elena couldn't deny the changes in him. There were moments when she caught him talking to the volunteers with a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Moments when he offered advice, not from a place of superiority, but from a genuine desire to help. And for the first time, she saw the man she had once dismissed as a cold, arrogant billionaire in a new light. Not as a symbol of everything she loathed, but as someone who was, perhaps, capable of growth. But was it enough? Was it enough for the man who had lied to her, who had used her for his own selfish game, to change overnight? Elena didn't know the answer. She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him fully. It was easy to see his transformation, but the pain he had caused her, both emotional and physical, wasn't something she could just erase. Yet, life, as it often did, moved forward. Elena couldn't deny that the center was thriving more than it ever had before. The funding Sebastian had secured helped expand their outreach programs, allowing them to assist even more families. The media coverage from the charity events he supported, albeit begrudgingly, painted a picture of him as someone who was genuinely committed to social change, not the ruthless billionaire who once turned his back on everything that didn't directly benefit him. But still, with each day, Elena struggled with the growing conflict inside her. She found herself admiring the work he did, admiring the man he was becoming, but her heart couldn't fully accept it. She kept wondering, was it real? Or was he just trying to win her back? It was a quiet evening when everything changed. Elena was standing in front of the large windows in her office at the center, watching as the city buzzed below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the streets. She had been working late again, trying to finish up a report before heading home, when a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned, expecting it to be one of the staff members. But to her surprise, it was Sebastian. His presence was no longer the same commanding force it once was. There was a humility in him now, a softness that caught her off guard every time she saw him. He didn't say anything immediately, just stood in the doorway, as if waiting for her to say something first. After a long, charged silence, Elena sighed and leaned against the desk. "What are you doing here, Sebastian?" "I wanted to talk," he said quietly. "I've been thinking a lot about everything about you, about us, about how I've been." He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "I know I can't undo what I did, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know, this isn't just about me trying to make up for a mistake. It's about me being a different person, someone who is worthy of being in your life. I don't expect you to believe me or forgive me right away, but I need you to see that I'm not the same man I was before." Elena swallowed, her throat tight. His words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so much time shutting him out, convincing herself that he wasn't worth her time or her heart. But here he was, offering his truth, offering the man he was now. For a long time, she didn't speak. She just stared at him, the world outside forgotten. Her heart, once so certain that she was better off without him, now pulsed with a quiet ache. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that this was real, that he had truly changed. But could she? "You're right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've changed, Sebastian. I see that. But what I don't know is if you can truly be the man I need you to be, if you can keep this up. Because I'm not asking for some temporary effort, for some temporary change. If we're going to move forward, it has to be real. No more games." Sebastian's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "I promise you, Elena, I've never been more real than I am right now." For the first time in a long while, Elena felt a flicker of hope in her chest. She had been so focused on his past mistakes, on how badly he had hurt her, that she hadn't given him a chance to show her the man he could be, the man he was becoming. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Then prove it," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with a quiet vulnerability. "Show me that you mean it." Sebastian didn't hesitate. Without another word, he crossed the room and took her hands in his touch warm, steady, and sincere. His voice was firm, yet full of the kind of tenderness she had never expected from him. "I will. I'll prove it every day, in every way. Not because you asked me to, but because it's what I want. To be a better man. To be the man who can earn your trust, your love." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, hands intertwined, as the world outside continued to turn, indifferent to the quiet but profound shift that had just taken place between them. It wasn't a fairy tale moment. There was no grand declaration or sweeping gesture, but it was real. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet transformation between Sebastian and Elena deepened. Elena had heard his words, had felt the sincerity in his actions, but there was still the lingering question in her mind. Could he truly change? Could the man she once thought of as selfish and manipulative become someone who was worthy of her trust, her heart? Sebastian's every move since that conversation had proven that he was determined to make good on his promise. He didn't rush her, didn't push for her forgiveness. He simply showed up, each day, in small but meaningful ways, reaffirming his commitment to the charity, to the people who needed him, and to her. The man who had once seen life as a game, who had used money and power to control his world, was now humbled by the realization that true value came not from what one could take, but from what one could give. One afternoon, as the air grew warmer and the flowers bloomed in the city's parks, Elena received a call. It was from a local shelter, one of the organizations that Rise Up had partnered with. They were facing a sudden shortage of resources, and their doors were at risk of closing if they didn't get immediate help. Elena felt the pressure mounting, her heart racing as she considered what to do. She could take money from the charity's emergency fund, but that wouldn't be enough. She needed a larger solution, a way to ensure this didn't happen again. Without thinking, she picked up the phone and dialed Sebastian's number. It rang for a moment, and then he answered. "Elena? What's wrong?" There was an urgency in his voice, a readiness to act. And for the first time, she didn't hesitate. "We need funding. And fast," she said, her voice tight with stress. "There's a shelter, their funding is running out, and they may have to close if we don't step in." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Elena's heart sank. Had she misjudged him? Was he going to pull back now that things weren't so easy? But then, to her relief, Sebastian spoke again, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll take care of it," he said. "I'll call in some favors, and we'll get them the funding they need. And we'll do more than that. I'll make sure they have enough to keep running long term. You don't have to worry." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her, but more than that, she felt something else stir inside her. Trust. She had been so guarded for so long, so determined not to let herself fall for him again. But here he was, stepping up in ways she hadn't expected. He wasn't just fixing problems for his own gain. He was doing it because it mattered. It mattered to him, and it mattered to her. Over the next few days, Sebastian followed through on his word. The shelter was saved, not just temporarily, but for the long haul, with financial security that would allow them to expand their services. And it wasn't just the shelter. He continued to support Rise Up, using his resources not for publicity or recognition, but because he genuinely believed in what Elena was doing. The once aloof billionaire had become a quiet force for good, someone who didn't need to be in the spotlight, someone who worked behind the scenes to make a difference. But as the weeks passed, something else started to happen. Elena found herself looking at Sebastian with new eyes. It wasn't just the charity work, or the fact that he had helped her when she needed it the most. It was the man himself. The man who had once been a stranger, then a source of frustration, then someone she couldn't trust, had slowly become someone she couldn't imagine her life without. One evening, after a long day at the center, Elena stood in front of the large windows again, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She heard the door open behind her and turned to find Sebastian standing there, his eyes soft but serious. "You're thinking about the shelter again, aren't you?" he asked gently, walking toward her. She nodded, but there was something different in the way she looked at him now. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, something that had been growing quietly inside her, almost imperceptible until now. "I'm thinking about everything," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "About how much you've changed, about how much you've proven to me that you're not who I thought you were, and about how, maybe, I was wrong about you from the start." Sebastian's gaze softened, and he took a step closer to her. "I don't need you to forgive me, Elena. I don't need you to accept me on my terms. I just need you to see me for who I am now, the man I am now." There was a quiet intensity between them, a weight to the moment that neither of them could deny. Elena took a slow breath, feeling the full force of the vulnerability between them. "I see you, Sebastian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I want to keep seeing you, not because of the bet, or because of what you did for Rise Up, but because I believe in the person you're becoming, and I want to see where this can go with you." A smile, soft and real, spread across Sebastian's face. He stepped closer and reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. I'll spend the rest of my life proving it, he said, his voice steady but filled with warmth. Not because I have to, but because I want to. For you. For us. And in that moment, everything felt right. The past, with its lies and manipulations, no longer had a hold on them. The future, uncertain as it always is, was now filled with possibility. Because, for the first time, they weren't bound by a bet. They weren't playing games anymore. They were simply two people, willing to give each other a chance, willing to build something real, something lasting. As they stood there, hand in hand, the world outside continued to turn, but for them, time had momentarily stopped. And whatever the future held, they would face it together. Thank you so much for joining me and listening to this entire story. I hope you enjoyed every twist and turn along the way. If you like the journey, don't forget to hit the like button, and be sure to subscribe to stay updated on all the exciting content coming your way. Your support means the world, and it motivates me to keep sharing these stories with you. Feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts or suggestions. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care, and see you in the next video.